Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Sales Enablement and Beyond, Using Games and Smart Implementation to Drive Success. Thank you for joining us. My name is Stephen Bowler. I'm the Marketing Director at Bottom Line Performance, and I am joined by Sharon Bowler, the President of Bottom Line Performance. Bottom Line Performance is a custom learning solutions company. We've been around for 21 years, and we design learning solutions ranging from a blended learning curriculum to a single e-learning course, as well as more engaging learning methods such as serious games or mobile applications. So as we're getting started, I'll ask you to type into the chat and share with us today, what do you hope to take away from today's session? Okay, so how to engage students who do not want to engage in and out of the classroom. Definitely, and games can certainly help with that. Understand more about what are the best methods for effectively using games. We'll definitely be covering that. Hoping for tips to develop sales-specific games. So Patty, all of the games that we're showing today were used with sales reps. Digital gaming options, more about integrating games into my training, what systems are being used and the security of those systems of using games for learning, and just in general looking to add to knowledge base. Oh, and this is a good one, examples of how other companies are using games for training. So all very good reasons to be here, and I hope that we can cover most of that. We're going to first begin at the end and talk about the results that a blended learning curriculum can have when it uses games. And then from there, we're going to identify some common industry challenges that most of you guys, no matter what industry you happen to be in, are probably facing. Once we've done that, I'll transfer it over to Sharon to talk about when games are ideal for learning and how to link them to learning. She'll show you how to create learner personas and map the type of game that you need to the characteristics of your learners. And then finally, I'll bring it back with 7 implementation tips for rolling out a game in your organization. Let's begin at the end and showcase some results. So imagine you just walked off the stage at a big industry conference and your team is super ecstatic because you won the big industry award. So that's what happened recently with the project that I'm going to share with you. This was a global product launch case study for Ventana Medical System. So they needed to make the product launch training really effective. So they partnered with us. We created a blended learning curriculum that was highly interactive and gamified. Now, because this product was so different from previous products, reps had a very different story to tell. So storytelling was really the goal of this launch program, and the learning goal was for learners to be able to effectively uncover unmet needs, then to convey the value proposition of the product to meet those unmet needs through the use of powerful and compelling stories. So we wove storytelling through all 3 phases of the launch curriculum, and in fact we made the curriculum itself a quest. We modeled it after the hero's journey found in in literature. So through pre-launch, launch, and post-launch, all of the activities kind of blended together and took them on this quest. So we'll start with pre-launch training here. So there were 4 gamified modules, or 3 gamified modules in 1 actual learning game. First, they learned about customer needs and had to travel through the cave, where they learned how to match customer needs to the corresponding feature. The waterfall was all about taking those features and identifying a high-level benefit that the product offered. And then all of that features and benefits knowledge was reinforced through a Knowledge Guru game. Knowledge Guru is our game-based learning platform, and that was through climbing a mountain. And then finally, once they'd climbed that mountain, they were up in the sky, and they had to rescue their customers off of these pillars by listening to their needs and picking the right story to tell to provide the benefit that customer needed. So the Cave of Needs module had them picking the right product features and traveling down these different paths in the cave. At the top of the waterfall, they had to build a raft to get the features and benefits matched up. By climbing the mountain, they were delivering scrolls to the guru at the top, and this is one of the Knowledge Guru game types that we have. And then finally, the story pillars, they had to go to each customer and tell the right story to rescue them off of their pillar. So this idea of a quest, like I said, was carried into the launch meeting, And this map was displaying in the room of the global launches, and there were 3 different global launch events around the world. So rather than just listing an agenda, it kind of is a creative and engaging way to take them through what they're going to be doing. So there was a facilitator and there were PowerPoint slides, but these PowerPoint slides did not have all the content that they needed to learn. The PowerPoint slides were just used to give the instructions for the activities that learners were completing in their participant guide. And the facilitator also had a facilitator guide that gave them everything they needed to deliver this training. So the participant guide had a variety of different games, activities, instructions for role play, and then participants played these games with other learners using cards, poker chips, and other tools. So then on the last day of the launch training, we taught these account managers about the training itself and how it was designed and why it was designed the way it was. We kind of explained a little bit of the adult learning that went into it so that they would appreciate why the training needed to be delivered the way it was, because then it was their job to take these training materials, go back to their home countries, and deliver it to the sales reps in their countries. So using this model, Ventana was able to just send 400 account managers to the launch events, and then those account managers were given these materials to take back and train the sales reps. And then once the sales reps were trained, the business unit had a way to consistently get feedback from the affiliates on what further support they needed, and then continue to provide further training during the reinforcement phase. Now, as a result, the curriculum was a winner in the innovation category of the 2016 L10 Excellence Awards. I love this quote from our stakeholder, Vince. He said, "The novel approach, gamification, and interactivity led to a high level of engagement, and that level of engagement and interaction of the learners translated into higher retention." So what about you? So you're here with your own sales enablement challenges. Go ahead and type into the chat what sales enablement challenges your organization is facing that impacts the training you deliver. So time and cost, the elephant in the room, people's time. You have another time answer. Unwillingness to step outside of the box. So that can be a tough challenge to navigate when you're shifting to a very different model of training. Resistance to change. I think that goes hand in hand with the last answer. Reps default to what they are comfortable with. I'm sensing some themes here. Managers, this has to have buy-in from the top. Senior management's buy-in. So you have to have strong stakeholders if you're going to move to this type of training. Challenges associated with selling through a global external sales force. Also the time it takes to train when sales leadership is just focused on selling and doesn't want to take time away from training. Our sales force hates being out of the field for training. So time, getting people to focus on the strategic value of training versus the value of just going and just being out selling. These challenges are all overlapping, and these are things that we hear from our customers, whether they're in the medical device space, the pharmaceutical space, the technology space, or another industry. And really, no matter what industry you're in, it does all come down to this. Preparing sales reps and account managers for success in an increasingly challenging environment. And that is why moving to more engaging learning strategies, such as the use of games, is so important. Okay, so now that I've been through the case study, we're going to turn it over and start talking about when games are the right solution. And I don't think there's anybody better to walk us through that than Sharon. So Sharon, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Steve. So let's talk about when are games the right solution. And I think the first step in this discussion is to make sure that we're all clear on what the definition of a game is. So the definition that I use all the time and that Carl Kopp and I use together when we're doing learning game design workshops is this one. A game's an activity, so it's interactive. It has an explicit goal or a challenge that people have to achieve, and that contrasts a lot with other kinds of learning activities that may be more completion-based or maybe more passive, where you're taking in information but there is no external goal or challenge that you're trying to achieve. It has rules for players in the system. So if you're doing a computer game, the rules are kind of built into the game system that you're using. If it's a live event or a tabletop event, those rules may be more explicit. There's interactivity, and that interactivity could be with other players, particularly in a live event. It could be just with the game environment if you're doing a computer game, or perhaps it's both. This is a key distinguishing feature, and that is feedback mechanisms. So games are powerful for this. They provide players with clear cues on how they're performing. You can see if you're doing well, you can see if you're not doing so well, and you can adjust your performance based on the feedback that you're continuously getting throughout gameplay. And finally, a game will result in some form of quantifiable result or outcome. You're going to have a win state, a lose state, or you hit the target, etc. And often, not always, but very often, it will trigger some sort of an emotional reaction in players. And I see this a lot of times when we're doing game events and in the game design workshop where we do a lot of gameplay. You'll physically see people's body language change. They'll lean forward. They'll become more animated in their features. They are more focused on what they're doing. And it kind of centers on the fact that you're trying to achieve that goal or overcome that challenge, and it gets you more engaged. So with that said, the one thing I didn't talk about was fun. And that's because fun is a word that oftentimes is a negative inside organizations. People are suspicious of it. So it's important for us to peel back the onion on what fun might be. And fun might be winning. People enjoy winning, and that gets them enthused. But it also might be achieving goals, which is something that organizations typically want people to do, is to achieve goals. It might be triumphing, having a difficult challenge that you master or a difficulty that you overcome. That feeling of triumphing over it is a powerful feeling, and most people find it enjoyable. Collaborating is fun. When people get around a game table and start working together or playing together, they find that enjoyable. Exploring and building are things that people often find fun. Creating something engages us mentally and emotionally, and it's something we usually view as enjoyable. Collecting things can be fun. It's a common game dynamic that people use, is that as part of achieving the goal, you have to collect things, and people find that enjoyable. Problem solving or strategizing are things that people find fun. They like figuring things out. They like being able to solve problems. Role-playing or imagining are fun. And intriguingly, people will often role-play or imagine in a game and feel very comfortable doing it, whereas outside of a game, in a sales training event, they may be less comfortable doing that same role-play. And finally, people like surprise, and games often include an element of surprise in them, and that can be a delightful experience to people. So there are a lot of things that make games fun, and interestingly, many of these things that make games fun are things that organizations want to be happening in their organizations anyway. So now let's flip and consider how people learn and remember. And the first thing that has to be there for people to learn anything is some motivation to learn. With zero motivation, whether that motivation comes from within the learner or an external push, there typically won't be any learning happening. The second thing that has to be there is some form of relevant practice. If I passively take in information but don't do anything to practice using it, I won't learn. The third thing is specific, timely feedback. So I can be motivated and I can be attempting to practice, but with no one to give me any feedback or nothing to give me feedback on how well or how poorly I'm doing, or to coach me on how I might improve in an area I'm struggling, I typically won't make learning gains. The fourth thing I need, and this goes to remembering it once I've learned it, is spacing and repetition. If I want to embed the skill or the knowledge into my long-term memory and be able to apply it later, I need to have multiple repetitions, multiple practices, multiple opportunities to hear the information, preferably spaced out over time. A fifth ingredient here is story. Story may not be part of everything, but story is one of the most powerful memory tools we have. It's very difficult for us to remember discrete facts or statistics, but when those same facts or statistics are housed within the story or personified via a story, we can remember them far more easily. All of these things work together to give us that ability to retrieve things later and to use them on the job. And the linkage here between games and that learning is pretty powerful. We need motivation and some emotional triggers to learn, and game elements that kind of naturally feed into that are the goal or the challenge that are kind of set up as part of the game. We need relevant practice, and a good learning game will be designed to give just that, multiple meaningful opportunities to practice. We need feedback, and games typically have that in spades. They're constantly giving you cues on how well or how poorly you're doing, and they usually give you an opportunity to adjust your performance so you can practice and get better and see the impact of what you're trying in the score that's reflected. We need spaced repetition, and those are very easy to build into a game by incorporating levels that allow you to progress upward with the challenges that you encounter getting increasingly more complex as you build proficiency, and by building in replayability, letting people have the opportunity to try again and play again for a higher score or a higher rating. And finally, we need story. And the narrative and the characters that you can embed into a story can be very powerful. So in the case study that we showed you, there wasn't one particular story that was built into this game. It was more the use of a theme that was overarching throughout the entire game experience. So I like to tell people that instead of asking when to use games, ask the question, how do I best use the right game for my particular need, my particular audience? So let's take a quick look at some common sales enablement objectives that people will have. The first is, as part of sales call planning, identify customer types and their barriers and their motivators. Another common one is, given specific questions or call objectives, share the appropriate safety and efficacy data on a product. Respond to objections or overcome objections. That's typically part of any sales enablement program. In a variety of customer situations, and often it might be changed to with a variety of customer types, ask the right questions to uncover customer needs. Based on customer needs, tailor the value proposition or the story you share. The value proposition that you give to a direct healthcare provider, a physician, or a nurse might be very different from the value proposition you're conveying to a hospital administrator. Can you do both? Based on the specific selling situation, choose and use the optimal tool for a situation. Typically, sales reps have a plethora of sales enablement tools, and they need to be able to choose the right tool for the right situation. Appropriately compare safety and efficacy data against alternatives. So there's 7 objectives there. Tell us which numbers are priorities for you. And if all of them are, you can just type all. So use the question space to do that, and then we'll kind of take a look. And Steve, my questions, up there they are. Okay, so I'm seeing 1, 3, 4, and 5. 3, 4, and 5. 2 and 7, somebody said all. Okay, so safety and efficacy, responding to objections, asking the right questions, tailoring the value propositions, all of those matter. So let's figure out which ones of those can you use games for. And intriguingly, you're going to see here I've got a chart where I put that cognitive task or that behavioral task that you want the learner to be able to do, identifying types of things, choosing between alternatives, sharing information, responding, comparing, asking the right questions, tailoring, putting together a story. And then these are game dynamics that you might consider using. So you might consider creating a matching game if you want people to be able to identify types. You might consider having people align things as part of identifying types or asking the right questions. So they might have to align with a customer the right questions. Exploration of an area or a scenario is a great game dynamic to use. Collection is a terrific game dynamic. And we have a pretty nice handout that we'd be happy to send you after this webinar that includes this information in it. if you would enjoy seeing that and a little bit more. And in the game design workshops that Carl Kopp and I do, we cover all of these dynamics and we show examples of different games that incorporate each of them so you can see how that they are used. We used almost every one of these in the Ventana example as we created different games to meet different activities. So best practices to follow as you are creating games. This is a big question we get because a lot of times when people want to venture into the area of incorporation of games, they don't quite know what to do and what not to do. So these are all research-based practices on what works and what to avoid. And the first is to design your game to meet very specific learning objectives. Don't make your game about everything. Instead, focus on one objective or two objectives and make your game about that. The second key is to focus your game on more than winning or losing. And that sounds counterintuitive because a game features a win state or a lose state. But if the game becomes all about the win, people often forget all about the learning. So you want to make sure that your game engages on another level besides just having the highest number of points or being the ultimate winner. The third is to embed your game within the curriculum and to include reflection activities around it. If you just have the game and there is nothing else with your initiative, it's very hard for people to make that transfer to their environment. So you need to include some sort of prods that help people reflect on how what they did in the game transfers to the work world. If you're doing an e-learning game, you can do that in the form of just some reflection questions at the end of the game, or you can do some type of a campaign outside of the game that encourages that reflection. Perhaps it's with coaching between manager and sales rep related to things that occurred in the gameplay. The fourth is to get your learners comfortable with the rules and the gameplay before starting, or build in tutorial guidance. Inevitably, your learners will not want to read the rules. They will not want to go through the tutorial. The downside of that is that they can get confused. So if it's critical that they play correctly and that they know what they're doing, make sure you build in that tutorial and you don't allow people to opt out of the tutorial. The fifth, and that kind of goes along with the fourth, is to make sure that your rules, your scoring, and your leveling are very simple and easy to understand. Cognitive load is a real thing in all of us. We can only take in so much information at any point in time, and if our brain is too full of trying to understand how the rules and the game work, there is little room left for the learning that we want to occur. So you don't want to frustrate your learners, and you don't want to tax them with overly complex rules, particularly if you're designing a game, as we frequently are, for things that are going to take anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes to play. Your complexity of rules should be in proportion to the amount of time you expect people to spend playing. When possible, create ways for learners to work in groups or teams. So if you're doing an online game and people are playing competitively, allow them to form into teams and have a team-based leaderboard so they feel some sense of camaraderie and commitment to a group larger than themselves. Make sure your cognitive activities in the game match to the cognitive activities required on the job. What this means is that you can feel free to use a fantasy element in your game. I mean, our hero's journey was a bit of a fantasy, but every activity that we had people use within those games linked to something they needed to do on their job. The eighth is to make sure that winning is the result of knowledge or skill acquisition and not chance. You want anybody's performance, points gained, achievements earned to be the result of something that they did requiring their knowledge or their skill, and not something that was, oh, you just drew a chance card and gained 50 points. The ninth is to think about replayability. You want people to have repetition in this game and to be able to try again. So make sure that you build that design into your game. And you'll notice that my 10th thing is the same as my 5th thing because I think it's worth repeating. Make sure you keep the rules, the scoring, and the leveling simple. So with all that said, let's take a look at the different types of games that you can consider using. The first is to consider board games. We show 3 examples here. These are all games that we have used in life science environments. 1 was a customer education game, and 2 were launch games. These kinds of games work extremely well in fostering team discussion, helping people collaborate together, so they may be competing table by table, providing application practice, or providing recall practice. So we've used them for all. The second is to consider using online computer games. Several of you, or at least one, mentioned that it's tough to bring reps in from the field. Online games can provide an attractive alternative, especially if it's designed as part of a curriculum where you're thinking about how you encourage that reflection remotely, or how you build in micro play games that you can do for just a few minutes at a time and get a cumulative effect over a period of weeks. Online games can be great for application practice. They can be great as a pre-work piece prior to a live event, and they can be great as post-training reinforcement. And the third is to consider using mobile games, and we're using more of these. Reps often have their phone as their most ready device. It's the one they have in their hands all the time. They may not want to pull out a laptop, and not all reps have tablets. So we've used phones as part of live events, as well as for the microlearning reinforcement. We typically don't have long playing games that require 30 to 60 minutes of seat time as part of a mobile device. Instead, we opt for what we call the microlearning events. Regardless of what game choice you make, it's important that you're mapping the game choice to the needs and the constraints of your learners. So not every one of these types is going to be appropriate for the learner you have. In marketing, buyer personas have been around for a long time. Buyer personas are a semi-fictional representation of who your ideal customer is, and that's based on market research and data that you have about your existing customers. So when you create that buyer persona in marketing, you're including their demographics, their behavior patterns, their motivations, and their goals. We need to do something very similar in training with the learner persona. We, at Bottom Line, are merging more to the idea of that learner persona, a semi-fictionalized representation of the target. You're going to base them on the research you do, plus demographic data that you might have. So the goal is to help you create a training experience and choose games that align with the realities and preferences of your learners. And at first, this is going to sound a little bit like an audience analysis. People are familiar with that. In an audience analysis, we'll typically ask, well, what's the age? What's the gender? What ethnic groups might be represented? How many years of experience do they have? How many years of experience in our company do they have? Do they have a college background, a high school degree, post-college? What does their LinkedIn presence look like? But we need to dig deeper if we're going to maximize the effectiveness of the game choices we make. We need to understand what their day looks like, what makes that role challenging for them, what values drive them. That definitely affects the kinds of game mechanics that you might use and the dynamics that you might use. What gaming experiences are typical for them. You're going to have people who don't play games at all. You're going to have people who might be relatively serious gamers. What device experiences and uses are typical for them? Where are they spending most of their time? And then related to the work they do, what does a sales call really look like? You might be very surprised to find out what a sales call looks like and what happens within it. So you need to understand, is a call the same every time? How do they vary? And how should training be designed to optimize this transfer into that rep's world? So here is an example of a learner persona. And I want you to take a look at this and just spend a moment looking at it, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me what on here is different from what you would typically include in an audience analysis. So we have a quote from our persona. Show me how to use info within a sales call. Keep it simple. Make it easy to access and use. And then we list our persona's name is Stephanie. We list her challenges and her values. We have a little profile there of her. We have a description of a call flow, a day in her life. and the devices in gaming that are typical for her. So how is this different for you? Go ahead and answer in the chat.
It looks like in general we're seeing that this is more detailed than what a typical audience analysis. Most people are saying that this is more in-depth than what they typically do.
Yeah, I'm seeing that a lot of times people don't ask for the personal information or how time in the day is spent, but that becomes really critical in understanding in the flow of the day where might a game work and where wouldn't it work at all. So yes, you want to understand what the audience has to do in their jobs, but understanding what their perceptions are around games, what they like, what they don't like, when they might play, that's very key as well, and when would it not be realistic to have them playing at all. Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to drive to, and let me show you what this looks like in terms of a plan that I might form. So as we go through, and I'm actually going to skip ahead here, Steve, just a bit. As we go through and we look at this persona, I might think, after I consider Stephanie and that persona and her values, her day, etc., that if I'm going to do any kind of self-paced game, the gameplay needs to be kept pretty short. Given that Stephanie is a very casual game player, I want to keep that gameplay pretty simple, also because of the short. She wants the most essential information and she wants it in context, so I want to make sure my content focuses on the selling environments and scenarios rather than simple recall. So I probably wouldn't use certain kinds of questions or techniques, and I would use others instead. I want that game content to reflect the call ladder that a rep needs to climb. So that's where understanding how her day might flow and how a customer interaction might flow over time becomes really helpful to me in the game design. I can think about perhaps leveling the game and making early levels deal with early calls and later levels deal with being further in the selling cycle. Given how mobile Stephanie is, I think a phone is likely to work better than a laptop unless I'm going to assume that she's going to do gameplay early morning or later evening. And while 41 is most definitely not old, which is the age we put on our persona, I do need to think, if I'm going to use the phone, about the text size, because someone who is in early 20s is going to have a possibly different ability to read small text than someone who is in their 40s. If there's going to be a live event as part of this environment, board games would work very well. I can see that that persona would respond pretty effectively as long as that gameplay is simple and they can quickly get into it. So my example plan for a launch looks something like this, where I might have something that's a 15-minute gamified e-learning course to cover some of the essentials of product positioning, key messaging, and competition. And I might use a game to reinforce and do a little bit of spaced repetition there, a knowledge guru game. And then in the launch meeting, I might go with an overarching territory acquisition game that is played throughout the day in rounds or levels as we introduce and practice new skills. And then post-launch, I might do a series of 3 to 5 mini games that I can push out for mobile play over a period of 1 to 3 months of time, and allow each game to focus on one concept or practice opportunity. And if I wanted to further expand on that, I might allow the rep to rate their confidence before they started playing, and then allow them to see reports that kind of show how things are changing, and possibly push out reports to their manager to kind of show where is that rep feeling very confident and also demonstrating good mastery, and where might they be low confidence or high confidence with low mastery. There's a lot of things I could do. With that said, Steve, I'm going to flip it over to you to kind of close us out and talk about implementation.
Great, thank you, Sharon. Okay, so we're going to end out close this out by talking about how to implement games. And no matter how well you've designed the games, how closely you've mapped those learner personas, we still find that the actual implementation of the game is just as important to the success of the game as how you've designed it. So we're going to close this out with 7 tips that will apply to most game-based learning implementations. To give you some background on these tips, I looked at 4 different users of our Knowledge Guru games and compared the commonalities between how they were doing it. And most of these use cases were organizations who went on to win an award for their Knowledge Guru game. So they were successful, they had results to show, and things had gone well for them. So I wanted to compare what was similar between these different implementations and try to find some common tips that other organizations can use. So based off of that, we have these 7 tips for you, and these are especially true for your first game-based learning implementation or when you're just getting started. And the first tip is that required works best. So while games are more engaging than many other forms of learning, we still find that making the experience required for your reps is going to be really the surefire method for making sure that people interact with your learning content. And this kind of is in response as well to a question that I had asked, someone had asked in the chat, asking if it was good to require games. And I would say the answer is yes. Our next tip here is to blend it into a curriculum and use as part of a learning solution. So obviously you have other sales training that you're doing, and you have, if you're doing a product launch, you should have a full curriculum and not just try to replace all of that great training with one game. And yes, the organizations that are using games and using them well are blending it into curriculums and not just shooting out a game without any other context. We also find, and this is especially true for your first game or your first games, start out by using them as a reinforcement or using them as a pre-work. And also in response to a question we received, a digital game can work well as either. It could be a good pre-work or it could be a good reinforcement. The trick is to do that research and do that analysis on the target learner, figure out what type of game they would best respond to during the pre-work phase and during the reinforcement phase, because that might change depending on what devices they're using or how much time they have before or after a launch to do that. Now we also find that offering some sort of incentive or providing sufficient motivation is very key to getting your games to have proper uptake. Now, if your learners are highly motivated, they have to make their commission and they believe that this training is going to help them do that and help them learn what they need to learn, you might not need to provide any external rewards. But if you're dealing with learners in a call center or people that are paid hourly, they might need some extra incentive to get them to want to go and take this training and really invest their time in it. So some sort of cash reward or the reward of just recognition within the organization can work really well. Gift cards, all of these different things we've seen people do with success. Number 5 is to create a communication strategy around the game. So most of you guys here are in the sales world or in the marketing world, and all of the effort that we invest in creating messages in products and trying to get those messages out there and creating campaigns around those messages, we go to great lengths to make sure that customers hear these messages multiple times. But when we roll out training, we don't always go to great lengths to make sure that people hear about the training and understand its value and know where to access it. And we just send it out once and hope that they take it. So when you're rolling out a game, building some communication around that and making sure that people really know what it is and how it's going to benefit them is really important. Number 6 is to use reporting and adapt the training. So many game-based learning tools and platforms are going to have some reports on the back end that you can use to assess how people are doing. Our Knowledge Guru platform has reports like that where you can see the learning objectives and questions in the game. But there's other platforms out there that also have good analytics. So when possible, the organizations that have those are using them and actively looking to incorporate those, what they're seeing in those reports, into what they're doing. And then finally, this is a great tip for when you're wrapping up a game, gather insights via surveys. The organizations that had the most success getting business results from their games did some type of survey afterwards to find out from learners how it went and collect feedback from them. So we definitely recommend that, especially when you're first getting started with games. So those are the 7 tips, and we've covered a lot of content with you. So I want to pause here. We have some time left, and open the floor to questions. We'll look and see what questions have come in as I've been going through and as Sharon was going through, and then we'll try to answer as many as we can. How do you get them engaged to want to do the survey? That's a great question, and that's a hard one to answer because I get a lot of requests for surveys and don't always do them, or often don't do them. I would say that explaining, giving them the why, that especially if these are sales reps that have that are invested in their job and want to do well and want to hit their numbers, explaining that the survey is going to help optimize training so that it's a better experience for them in the future. That could help if you need to. Some sort of incentive can also work well with surveys. I don't know if Sharon has any other thoughts there.
I would say that be realistic. You will not get 100% off of your survey. We usually look for around 10%. If we get that, we feel like we're getting a pretty decent representation, but often you get more. I think another key, Steve, that we've used with great success is to make sure that you don't include more than 2 or 3 questions on your survey. We do really well with the 2-minute survey. What intimidates people most is seeing 20 questions.
Yeah. All right, so we also have a question here. Can you point us to actual examples of sales-related games we can use for inspiration? Sharon, what do you think?
I think we can certainly show you some offline things. Most of our games are proprietary, but I think the Knowledge Guru platform, we can certainly show you the platform, and many people have used it to create sales-related games with great effectiveness. So that's a great example of a platform that you can look to. You can also then schedule some time with us, and we can show you some very custom solutions that we have done.
Okay. The question is, how do companies work with you in developing this approach?
So the approach that we typically take is oftentimes to start with a design meeting. And we'll usually start with analysis and design effort to kind of consider, so we can craft the learner persona there, and we can come up with a design, and we can build some initial prototypes and concepts. And then from there, if we're all in alignment, then we can work on actually building that out. So you can have 2 things. You can have a strategy that you're just wanting to employ for one specific endeavor, and you can be thinking more broadly into perhaps you want to gamify your entire approach to training, which I am less of a fan of personally, but I know folks do it. So our focus tends to be on looking at the initiative level, how we might gamify that initiative.
And I want to answer an earlier question that I answered in the chat for the whole group. He asked, if you have 1,000 reps, how do you utilize the idea of a learner persona? And what I said was, with 1,000 people, it's likely that you're going to have more than one persona. When you're doing the research on those learners, hopefully you're going to find some common buckets, and you can develop a handful of personas. And then the trick is to look for what overlaps between those personas when you're designing your solution, and focus on those, knowing that you're not going to be able to make everything please everybody.
Yes, I responded to that as well, Steve, and I said typically you're not going to end up with more than a few personas, even for 1,000 people. And the goal there is to make sure that you address the needs of each one. So that gives you the opportunity to consciously choose some game design elements that you think would appeal to each one. And I see that somebody commented that they probably would want to do a pilot to see if it works. Absolutely. Before you take on a large-scale initiative, try piloting with a small group. And in game design in particular, it's a little bit different in that if you're designing a 100% custom game, you may consider including the target user in a couple of play tests early on. So when we are designing games, we're designing them in a very iterative fashion, where we do a build, and then we play test, and we modify, and then we play test again, and then we modify again. Any final questions?
So as final questions are rolling in, I want to let everybody know that I will be sending out the recording of this webinar and an invitation to our next webinar, along with any session resources that we have for you. We do have a learner persona worksheet that we will send to you. And if you like this session and want it given at your organization, we would love to do that and set that up for you, so just let us know. So we have a question: who do we contact to potentially partner? So if you're interested in reaching out to us, Sharon and I's emails are on the screen. You can reach out to either of us, and we can get a conversation started with you.
All right. Thank you so very much. It's been a real pleasure being with you this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you guys very much for attending.